In fact, one of the strongest steroids ever produced is something called Hello, welcome to part 2 of the steroid series. Part 1 was all about the introduction, and now we're actually getting into the education on steroids. So, as we spoke about in part 1, anabolic steroids can either be anabolic or androgenic. Now, anabolic is pure muscle mass, and androgenic is all the other effects that steroids give you that is not muscle mass related. So, androgenic would be things like increasing the weight of your prostate, increasing your body hair, maybe some acne, things like deepening your voice, so speaking like this. Potentially some people get that, some others don't, but they're all the androgenic effects, especially if you think going through puberty, some of these effects are very androgenic. Testosterone has a mix of both. It has an anabolic to androgenic ratio of about 1, meaning it's just as anabolic as androgenic. And this makes sense because when we go through puberty, we really want it to be 1 for 1, otherwise we would end up with huge amounts of muscle mass, and that's not really what happens during puberty. So it makes sense. Testosterone, as we go through the series, remember testosterone is our baseline of 1. So let's get into it. How do steroids actually work? Well, once you inject a steroid, it moves around your bloodstream and it will make its way to the cells, and it actually can freely diffuse into your cell itself and sit in the cytoplasm of your cell. So it moves around from the injection site through the bloodstream to your cell, moves into the cell. But once in our cells, it can't directly enter our nucleus. So it's actually stopped from entering our nucleus. It just sits in the cytoplasm. And there's good reason for that, is because once it's in the nucleus, it can start reading our DNA, which is all our genetic material, which is found in the nuclei of our cells, and it would be able to start making proteins, primarily muscle protein for anabolic steroids. And if steroids were just freely allowed to move into this nucleus, we would have a big problem because we would end up looking like this. So it can't just freely start copying DNA until it moves through the gatekeeper into the nucleus, which is the androgen receptor. So there's a big gate, and the androgen receptor is the guy at the front, like the bouncer at the front of a nightclub. So the steroid actually has to interact with the androgen receptor before it's actually allowed into the nucleus itself. Now, the androgen receptor is part of a nuclear receptor superfamily, and all these receptors, I should say, in the family have a direct ability to mediate and control the expression of our genes, but only in response to steroids. So what happens? The steroid actually has to bind to the androgen receptor for it to start working. And there are actually many nuclear receptors, not just the androgen receptor. We have the estrogen receptor, we have a progesterone receptor, we have the glucocorticoid receptor, and the mineralocorticoid receptor. These are all receptors that allow expression of target genes once a ligand, now a ligand being something that actually directly binds to the receptor and turns it on, and that is, in our case, the ligand is a steroid. And the androgen receptor is divided into 4 parts of about 918 amino acids in length, remembering that most receptors are proteins and proteins are made of amino acids, so it's about 918 amino acids in length, with about 4 main parts. The main parts being the N-terminal domain, which is involved in transcription. If we remember from part 1, transcription being the way that our body takes information from our DNA, but it doesn't want to touch the blueprint. So the DNA is the blueprint. It wants to take information from the blueprint without actually taking the original manuscript out of the nucleus. So it will copy it into something called mRNA, and that is then essentially like the photocopy that the body then uses to make new proteins. So the N-terminal domain is involved with transcription. The DNA binding domain, so this is actually where the androgen receptor binds directly to the DNA. The hinge region, not much to say here, just a hinge in the actual receptor, and may be involved in it changing shape once the steroid binds to it. And the ligand binding domain, which is the most crucial part that we're focused on, which is actually where the steroid binds to the receptor itself and kickstarts this whole process off. And what is the whole process? Well, it all starts in our cells. So usually the androgen receptor lies dormant in the cytoplasm of our cells. Now the cytoplasm is just the watery environment that actually fills our cells. And basically this protein called heat shock protein 90 is giving this androgen receptor a big bear hug and saying, no, you're not active, you need to stay inactive until a steroid comes and binds to you. So this heat shock protein is attached to the androgen receptor and doesn't allow it to be active until a steroid comes along and binds to the androgen receptor. The steroid will come along, it will bind to the ligand binding domain, which is, like I said, part of the androgen receptor. The receptor then changes shape and actually becomes active. The heat shock proteins, which were bound to the androgen receptor, they fly off, they're gone, and the androgen receptor is now fully active and able to do its work. It flies into the nucleus, it can't get in there quickly enough, and it directly latches onto our DNA and starts reading and copying information to then be used to make muscle protein, primarily with anabolic steroids. So basically, this is how anabolic steroids put on muscle mass. Once you have more of this substrate going in and more of these receptors going into the nucleus, copying information to then be used to make muscle, you just get huge amounts of muscle mass that is being produced, and that's how we get bigger. That's how steroids work to put on muscle mass, basically. And like I said in part 1, this whole process is called transcription, and is the way our body doesn't touch the original manuscript because it doesn't want to damage our DNA and use that, but it's almost like taking a photocopy of the original manuscript to then use that genetic code to then code for proteins without touching the DNA, because our body just says, no, I don't want to ruin that original manuscript. We're going to use a copy. And if you're actually interested in this process in depth, check out this video where I explain exactly how transcription and translation work for muscle cells. But all we need to know is that the blueprint is the DNA. Once the androgen receptor is turned on, it moves in, takes that blueprint, and then goes on and makes so much muscle that you can't even believe. And this is how androgen receptor and steroids work, because you just have so many of these androgen receptors turned on that, yeah, you just put on muscle mass at a rate far beyond what you could naturally. Now, in terms of ligands, which are steroids binding to the androgen receptor, we have strong binders, we have intermediate binders, and we have weak binders, and that is called the relative binding affinity. So, a steroid can bind very, very strongly to the androgen receptor, and it will not let go, and therefore the rate of transcription will be really, really high. In fact, one of the strongest steroids ever produced is something called methyltrianolone, and that steroid is so strong that it binds to the androgen receptor and basically never gives it up. It is just bound continuously to this androgen receptor, and the amount of transcription that happens, so the amount of pretty much muscle mass that's being created, is absolutely huge. And this is one of the most potent, but also one of the most toxic steroids you can ever get, because it is just, yeah, it's just crazy how strong that steroid is in not giving up the androgen receptor binding site. In fact, interestingly, methyltrianolone is very similar in chemical structure to trenbolone. As we all know, everyone knows trenbolone, one of the most powerful steroids ever created. Not even meant to be for humans, mind you, just meant to be for bloody cows. And then some guy said, oh yeah, I'm gonna try a cattle drug on myself. So that's how trenbolone came along. Never actually designed or produced for humans, but there you go. Very similar in chemical structure, and that is why trenbolone is actually so potent as well. Basically, the potency of a steroid is just how firmly it binds to that androgen receptor, and trenbolone just doesn't give up. It is latched onto that androgen receptor. It does not give it up, and once it's latched on, the amount of muscle that you can create, like I said, is just absolutely enormous. In fact, methyltrianolone is so strong and has such a strong binding affinity that in a lot of studies, it is actually used as the highest benchmark, and all the other steroids are compared to that. If you're the benchmark, you know you're doing something right, and well, actually, you're not doing something right, because it's the most toxic chemical ever probably produced in terms of steroids, but it's very potent. So all the studies use that as a benchmark, and you know that's when it's really, really potent. Another really strong and potent binder to the androgen receptor is nandrolone, and a very weak binder would be something like stanozolol, for a very particular reason, which we will get into in the later episodes, especially when we start to talk about chemical structure. But how exactly does it bind to the androgen receptor? Well, it involves a water-hating interaction between the androgen receptor and the steroid, and pretty much the steroid slips into a pocket on the androgen receptor. It slips into that pocket, latches on, and then the androgen receptor is active and able to move into the nucleus of the cell and start all its work in muscle growth. And really from there, with testosterone as the base, it's really just a matter of figuring out which chemical structures bind to the androgen receptor really, really strongly, and also don't give up that binding spot very easily. From there, you can then determine just how much transcriptional activity and muscle mass the steroid will put on, and that is how the most powerful steroids in the world are pretty much created. And in part 3, we will look at the pharmacology and the exact chemical structures that make steroids really, really powerful. So if you're interested, please consider watching part 3, and part 4 will be the most interesting in the series, where we actually create and design the most powerful steroid based on these modifications. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate all the support. I will see you in the next part of this series, and I hope you're enjoying the series on the whole, all about steroids, but I will see you in part 3, part 4, and all the way on, I think part 13. Yeah, we have a long way to go, but I'm really enjoying this, and thank you so much for watching, guys. I will see you in the next video.